Can you take on the impossible task and give a brief history of programming languages from your perspective?
So I guess you could say programming languages started probably in the late 40s or something like that. People used to program computers by basically putting in zeros and ones using something like switches on a console, and then, or maybe holes in paper tapes, something like that. So extremely tedious, awful, whatever. And so I think the first programming languages were relatively crude assembly languages where people would basically write a program that would convert mnemonics like add, ADD, into whatever the bit pattern was that corresponded to an add instruction. And they would do the clerical work of figuring out where things were. So you could put a name on a location in a program and the assembler would figure out where that corresponded to when the thing was all put together and dropped into memory. Early on, and this would be the late 40s and very early 50s, there were assemblers written for the various machines that people used. You may have seen in the paper just a couple of days ago, Tony Burker died. He did this thing in Manchester called autocode, a language which I knew only by name. But it sounds like it was a flavor of assembly language, sort of a little higher in some ways. And it replaced a language that Alan Turing wrote, which you put in zeros and ones. But you put them in backwards order because that was how the hardware worked. Very strange.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. It's backwards.
So assembly languages, then let's call that the early 1950s. And so every different flavor of computer has its own assembly language. So the EDSAC had its, and the Manchester had its, and the IBM whatever 7090 or 704 or whatever had its, and so on. So everybody had their own assembly language.
And assembly languages have a few commands, addition, subtraction, and branching of some kind, if then type of situation.
Right. They have exactly, in their simplest form at least, one instruction per, or one assembly language instruction per instruction in the machine's repertoire. Right. And so you have to know the machine intimately to be able to write programs in it. And if you write an assembly language program for one kind of machine and then you say, gee, it's nice, I'd like it in a different machine, start over. Okay. So very bad. And so what happened in the late 50s was people realized you could play this game again and you could move up a level in writing or creating languages that were closer to the way that real people might think about how to write code. And there were, I guess, arguably 3 or 4 at that time period. There was Fortran, which came from IBM, which was formula translation, meant to make it easy to do scientific and engineering computations.
I didn't know that. Formula translation.
That's what
wow.
it stood for.
Yeah.
There was COBOL, which is the common business-oriented language that Grace Hopper and others worked on, which was aimed at business kinds of tasks. There was ALGOL, which was mostly meant to describe algorithmic computations. I guess you could argue BASIC was in there somewhere. I think it's just a little later. And so all of those moved the level up. And so they were closer to what you and I might think of as we were trying to write a program. And they were focused on different domains. Fortran for formula translation, engineering computations, let's say, COBOL for business, that kind of thing.
And still used today, at least Fortran probably.
Oh, yeah. COBOL too.
COBOL.
But the deal was that once you moved up that level, then let's call it Fortran, you had a language that was not tied to a particular kind of hardware because a different compiler would compile for different kind of hardware. And that meant 2 things. It meant you only had to write the program once, which was very important. And it meant that you could, in fact, if you were a random engineer, physicist, whatever, you could write that program yourself. You didn't have to hire a programmer to do it for you. Might not be as good as you'd get with a real programmer, but it was pretty good. And so it democratized and made much more broadly available the ability to write code.
So it puts the power of programming into the hands of people like you.
Yeah. Anybody who is willing to invest some time in learning a programming language and is not then tied to a particular kind of computer. And then in the 70s, you get system programming languages, of which C is the survivor. And
what does system programming languages mean?
Programming languages that would take on the kinds of things that were necessary to write so-called system programs, things like text editors or assemblers or compilers or operating systems themselves, those kinds of things. And
They have to be
Fortran,
feature rich. They have to be able to do a lot of stuff, a lot of memory management, the access processes, and all that kind of stuff. Parallel processing.
it's a different flavor of what they're doing. They're much more in touch with the actual machine but in a positive way. That is, you can talk about memory in a more controlled way. You can talk about the different data types that the machine supports in a way and more ways to structure and organize data. And so the system programming languages, there was a lot of effort in that call it the late 60s, early 70s. C is, I think, the only real survivor of that. And then what happens after that, you get things like object-oriented programming languages, because as you write programs in a language like C, at some point scale gets to you and it's too hard to keep track of the pieces, and there's no guardrails or training wheels or something like that to prevent you from doing bad things. So C++ comes out of that tradition.
And then it took off from there. I mean, there's also a slightly parallel track with a little bit of the functional stuff with Lisp and so on. But I guess from that point, it's just an explosion of languages. Yeah, there's the Java story, there's the JavaScript, there's all the stuff that the cool kids these days are doing with Rust and all that.
Yeah.